Aenig by Kaylee. Chapter 12. Ndi couldn't focus after that. What Trix had said was, well, kind of threateningly sweet. The woman had been entirely wrong as to the nature of her and Kale's interactions, but she had come clean to someone who was close to Dylan about their underhanded tolerance of the maniac. Ndi threw her scalpel into the sink with a loud clank and huffed aloud as she fell onto the couch, as though this day couldn't get any worse. "Should I come back?" a voice asked softly. Ndi looked up to see Sylas hesitate at the door. "Kale's an asshole," she spat out. She hadn't seen much of the blonde scout since she'd been rescued, but he seemed nice enough. "I just got the 'if you hurt him, I'll rip you a new one' speech from Trix." "Oh," Sylas chuckled. "Don't mind her. Trix just has a big heart and a soft spot for damaged things." Clearly the guy had no idea as to the woman's real intentions. "Damaged is putting it lightly," the girl sighed. She waited for him to say something, but he only hovered awkwardly on the threshold of the lab. "How can I help you?" The blonde's teeth nibbled at his lips as his eyes scanned the room and his hands fidgeted nervously. "I'm looking for Dylan. Something's wrong with my gauntlet. I thought it might be clogged, but I cleaned it so well you could eat off it, and it's still not firing." He glanced over at the corpse on the table. An image surfaced, of facing something that terrifying with a malfunctioning weapon. He shuddered. "Yana said she saw him come down here." "You just missed him. He left with the overgrown toddler." And he tried to hide the bite in her tone, but it had become habit to sneer whenever the man was brought up. It didn't escape her notice that she was the one bringing him up 90% of the time, but denial and avoidance were luxuries she could now afford, and she fully intended to keep splurging. Time to change the topic? "I could take a look at it." The man hovered on his back foot, stopped mid-turn. "Huh?" Ndi pointed to the gauntlet, and Sylas handed it over after only a moment's contemplation, even if he did so with a skeptical look. She turned it over in her hands and directed the scout to a drawer where he'd find a screwdriver. He returned slowly and fidgeted while she proceeded to take the mechanics apart. Aside from the tink of metal on metal, silence stretched between them for longer than was strictly considered polite, what with Sylas staring at her while she worked. But it didn't agitate her the same way it did when Kale stared. "He's not all that bad, you know," the blonde offered. Ndi looked up to see him leaning against the side of the table, with his arms folded across his chest uncomfortably, though his ankles were crossed in a failed attempt to appear casual. She couldn't help cocking a judgmental eyebrow at him. "You don't sound so convinced." "I'm not," he admitted with a chuckle. "But that's just because he scares the living hell out of me." He was still smiling. Weirdo, Ndi thought. "Thrisha was talking on the way back," he confessed, as though it were a secret he'd overheard. "She had to give Kale her shot because he'd given his to your dad. Essentially, he gave up his trump card because he figured Ukwa was such a big guy that he could use more if there was any trouble." He shrugged and glanced around the room so he wouldn't have to meet Ndi's disbelieving face. "He talks big, but now don't get me wrong, I've never heard his mouth cash a check he couldn't pay. But he acts tough because he is, and there's definitely something wrong with him mentally, but he surprises me every now and then. He can be real sweet sometimes." "Did you just use the word sweet to describe Kale's sex?" Ndi laughed, because it just sounded so ludicrous. "Do you even value your sensitive parts?" "Yeah," Sylas chuckled self-consciously and scratched the back of his head, even as his cheeks flushed. "I know you won't tell him, though." He stuck his tongue out at her and then hopped up onto the corner of the table between the corpse's knees. "I mean, like a year or two ago, Maish had been going out of his mind because he'd been wanting to ask Yana out forever. Like before the city was even built, kind of forever. Anyway, he got himself so worked up about it because he thought for sure that she'd turn him down, so Cale went straight up to Yana and told her that Maish had a huge crush on her and wanted a date. That's not sweet, Ndi huffed. That's downright humiliating. But she ended up going out with him, confessing that she was crushing on him too, and they've been inseparable ever since, Mike reminded her softly. I don't think his motives were exactly pure, the girl snorted. All right then. The scout seemed to pick up on the challenge Ndi hadn't even known she'd put out there, as he dived into another story. We picked up a guy, a few months before we found you. As it turns out, he was a rapist. Drade pulled the girl's face taut, so Sylas barreled on with the story. The guy tried to assault Doc, and Damien only found his left hand in the maze. Turns out Cale had walked in before anything happened, and he fed the guy to a nymph. That's overkill, Ndi deadpanned. That's Cale, Sylas shrugged. The girl shook her head, turning the gauntlet in her hands over to get a better angle. Sounds like you've got a soft spot for him. I just think people judge him without remembering that he's damaged, the blonde said with a tone of finality. He found purpose with the outbreak, and we all avoid him because he's dangerous. But everyone, and I mean everyone, in the city denies that if anything had to go wrong, behind him would be the safest place to be. Ndi gazed up at Sylas and envied him his optimism. Why are you telling me this? The scout offered her a small smile and gestured to the machine she was working on. Tit for tat. You're fixing my gauntlets. I'm telling you to give the guy a chance. She scoffed. Doesn't really seem like a fair trade. And that would be your opinion, he shrugged. Either way, I think Cale is one of those people that if you ask 10 different people, they'd give you 10 different descriptions. Maybe it's best you decide for yourself. Something in the gauntlet clicked, and the needle shot out of it. Luckily, none hit the girl. She chuckled once the initial shock had worn off. There's the problem. You cleaned it so well you took all the grease off. You need to lube up your girl before using her, she winked. The comment apparently went entirely over the blonde's head, because he thanked her profusely and promised he'd go find some right that moment.